Okay, today I'm doing a segment that we've called Kicking It with Dr. Pearl, and I have the pleasure of having a friend, a colleague in the way that I would say we both went to Indiana University. I am by no means a swimmer, but we also share a medical background. I'll let Gary Hall explain more about that. The purpose of this vignette is to talk a little bit about how each person that's coming to the table has managed with their foot function through either their sport and everyday life and things that they've learned about their own feet medically and otherwise. And in this particular segment, we have the unique aspect of having somebody that has not only participated at an elite level of sport as an Olympic swimmer in 68, 72, and 76 at the Summer Games as a swimmer, but also someone that has participated as a coach and as a visionary in his field, writing 2 textbooks, the most recent one, which I'm going to let him explain. The other unique aspect is that he has a swimming legacy with his son, Gary Jr., who happens to be, his photo happens to be behind me, and I've had the pleasure of collaborating with him on some diabetes awareness and sport awareness. So welcome, Gary, to this segment of what I'm calling Kicking It with Dr. Pearl. Great to see you. And why don't you start with kind of telling us a little bit about something about your journey and, about your feet.
Well, thank you, Dr. Pearl. I appreciate it. Great honor to be on the show. And just a little bit of background. I swam in 3 Olympics back 100 years ago in 1968, 72, 76. Was honored to carry the flag in the 76 Olympics, which I share with only one other swimmer. That's the guy that most people will know, Michael Phelps, who carried the flag in 2016. I was in medical school in my last Olympics in Montreal and took a year off, a leave of absence, and fortunately made the team. And then I came back, resumed my medical studies, and then decided to go into ophthalmology, where I practice in Phoenix, Arizona. I went to Indiana University for my residency in ophthalmology as well, medical school, University of Cincinnati. Went back went to Phoenix, where I lived and practiced for 25 years. And that's where I really set up my practice. But at the end of 25 years, decided to make a huge left turn in my career. Wasn't totally excited about the changes that were happening in medicine at the time. Felt like I could reinvent myself. I was still young enough, I think about 56, when I started coaching, and elected to move to Florida, where I lived in Isla Morada for 15 years, and started teaching swimming technique, which was an area of swimming that wasn't really particularly focused on, and in a sport that's highly technical. I felt it was needed. So my background in undergraduate was physics. I had a coach, Doc Councilman, who was the father of science and swimming, who was a physiologist, but also knowledgeable in physics and psychology, and really was a jack of all trades. He had a brilliant mind, and he kind of inspired me to want to go into coaching. So that's what I've been doing since. My foot problems then started when I'm not even sure exactly, but I will say this, genetically, I had a mother, God rest her soul, who had very, very bad foot problems later in life, and started developing, she had bunions and started developing problems from that, had surgery. I don't remember the timing of which, but she ended up developing hammer toes all across her metatarsal and her all 5 toes, and just became a cripple. Later in life, when she was virtually on her deathbed, I really, and I didn't see her that often, and I know she was unable to wear shoes probably for the last 10 or 15 years of her life, and more, sandals, so her toes could be, would be hampered by the hammer toe, but they were virtually deformed. feet. And I felt bad for her because I don't know that I could have done anything if I'd known anything or known you. I wish I'd known you at that time to send her to. But she got through. She never complained about it, but she got through basically very hampered by bad feet. So when I was probably in my, I would say early 50s, I started to notice my um, second metatarsal starting to, flex upward and getting contracture and developing that hammer toe. And I had a hallux valgus as well, and that was, worsening over time. And I think it was around 2010 that I said, gosh, I don't want to end up with like my mom. I got to do something about this. And that's where I went to get a couple of opinions. And I ended up going to the Cleveland Clinic. And this is probably one thing I regret. And again, I wish I'd known you at the time. I went to the Cleveland Clinic and saw an orthopedic guy who also, by the way, graduated from Indiana University.
Wow.
It was a young guy, a nice guy, who was a foot specialist in orthopedics. And I should have known better when I went into the exam there. And right in before surgery, he looked at the feet and he said, I hate doing this bunion surgery. And that was a bad sign. But I went ahead and had it done. And he ended up, I think, breaking the first metatarsal, realigning it, released a tendon. And then he put a pin in the second metatarsal to straighten it. And I didn't help matters. When I was in a cast, I remember sitting at my desk during the recovery period. And I was trying to push my chair back, and my desk was against the wall. And it was the cast was a little slippery. And so I'm pushing with both feet, and the cast slips on the carpet. And I jam my foot right into the wall with the pin, and the pin just went into my foot. Really painful, and I knew I messed it up. So I went to see him like the next day, and it was only a couple of weeks into the surgery. He ended up having to remove the pin early. So it didn't really change the hammer toe very much. At the end of the day, the bunion was improved for the surgery. The hammer toe really didn't change much. But then a few years later, it was interesting because I'm coaching, right? And I got a client from Pennsylvania who's down. And, he looks at my feet and he says, and this guy's a financial guy, he handles the endowment for the DuPont company. He's a brilliant guy. And he's very smart. And his son is training with me. And he looks at my feet and he said, well, you have Morton's toe. And I had never heard of Morton. He said, there's this incredible book that Dudley Morton wrote back in the 20s. And he ordered a copy and he sent it to me. And he said, you can really help that situation if you just put a little pad under your first metatarsal and just elevate that. And he said back then that, that would help cure the problem of the valgus and the hammer toe. So I said, what have I got to lose? It's a lot easier than going through surgery. And I don't really want to go through that again. So I started doing that. And that was, I want to say 2010 or 11. And every pair of shoes, I always wear orthotics. So every pair of shoes I've ever had, I either put that, if I get new orthotics, I put that I cut out a little, piece of an insole and glue it right under the head of the metatarsal. So it just elevated a little bit. And lo and behold, I have not progressed in nearly 10 years. That hammer toe stayed basically the same. Hasn't gone to the other toes. It's a little bit on the left foot, but not, I never had surgery on the left foot. So I'm kind of stable, and I feel thankful to this guy who's a financial guy for giving me foot advice at that time, which really, really helped me out. But so that's my foot story, and I don't have any issues really with my feet. They're blessed. I have very loose ankles, as most swimmers do. A lot of plantar flexibility, but I'm happy that things are status quo, No, shoulder issues I have, but not foot issues.
You
I
you
do
don't
have,
have that metatarsal pad or sling installed in your shoe now, do you? That you could, is it something that you could show?
yeah, let me pull my orthotic out
Yeah.
and show it to you
And
because I,
we're gonna do a swap. I'm gonna show you something I developed for a stiff toe or hallux limitus. I'm gonna
so
grab that. Oh, that's
there's my
fantastic. I'll let you
orthotic.
talk. Go ahead.
Got a little bit of my sock on there, but that's all I do. I just glue that little piece on there like that. I don't know if you can see it. It's
Hmm.
pretty thick. I mean, it's a spongy, piece of
And
an
just so that I
insole.
can see the orientation, do you have that so that it's going, that is under the first only, or does it extend over to the second as well?
No, it's pretty much. I think. Well, that's a good question. Let me put.
Yeah, match it up.
No, it's really just under the first.
Uh-huh.
And the first metatarsal doesn't quite. It hits right. You can see the
Right.
depression right there, and it hits right there. But it's amazing that that little thing has made a difference and really kept me pretty much status quo through all
Yeah,
these years. It's now like 10
it's
years.
it is nice when you can come up with a conservative splint or device that will either augment a surgery or make the need for surgery obsolete. One of the things that I recently developed because of my interest with keeping athletes, weekend warriors, and everyday people on the field or in their job is I developed a sock-like splint that I call the turf toe splint. The turf toe splint sounds a lot more sexy than the hallux limitus splint, but essentially they're two different problems, but the splint works for both. And essentially it's a modification of what you have already been wearing.
Mhm.
The difference is that it's a little more rigid. It's not going to be quite as, for some people, comfortable. So one of the things that we're doing is we're adding some padding. But for the most part, most people have tolerated the rigidity of this particular splint. But unlike you, where you had a fairly successful, for the most part, bunion surgery, where you're not left with a toe that's like a rock joint where you can barely move it a few degrees, you have
Yeah.
presumably some range of motion, which doesn't make the need for something more rigid a priority. What I did with this particular splint, and I'm going to have off camera, we'll have the splint so I can show you, just to give you a quick look at what the differences are. It is something that helps not only with the chronic situation of somebody that has a stiff toe, but the acute situation, like recently Patrick Mahomes with his turf toe injury in the Super Bowl, and he had a much more bulky splint. But what we're doing with the company that I partnered with, OS First, is we have now a more svelte splint that can be used in almost any shoe. And I'm going to grab one to show you just to take a look at it. That's fine. I can take it from there. So essentially it's in the shrink wrap, but it has a polyurethane flexible, I almost call it, Gary, and it's the analogy that I've used before, almost like a diving board type of flexible thing here. So there is
Yeah.
some
Yeah.
pullback to this. So what happens, and the interesting thing is, I know you're a man of science. We actually had one measurement only, because it's very difficult, as you know, to get longitudinal studies. But we had one measurement in a lab where we looked at the force going through the big toe, and we actually found a 30% decrease in the force going through the big toe. So that speaks to somebody going from like a level 7 to a level 3 on a 10-point scale, let's say. And so sometimes that's the difference between needing surgery and not. And then we've had similar situations where somebody with a 4 goes down to let's say a 1. So, as you know, in medicine, there's no one solution for every person. It's multidimensional, multifactorial, and you have to obviously be tuned to the needs of the patient and the athlete.
Yeah.
Maybe you can share some of the things that you had to do as a coach with either swimming injuries or deficits in flexibility, maybe with the feet specifically. I know you've worked a lot and asked me some questions in the past
Yeah.
about the ankle. And that kind of leads into a little bit about your book, which I know you're going to share with us, the cover
Yeah.
photo and such, so that we can see that as well.
Well, I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit here,
Sure.
Ben, and I hope that's okay
Yeah,
because
no, I
you've
love being
taught me
put on the
more about
spot.
the ankle. You've taught me more about the ankle than anybody, and it's an interesting joint. And swimming, as you know, is a lot about flexibility, and the ankle turns out to be one of the key joints, not just for the freestyle butterfly and backstroke, where we need to develop this really extreme plantar flexibility, but it's what I call pigeon-toed or inverted plantar flexibility, the ability to not just point like a ballerina, but turn the feet in. So as you're kicking down against the vortex or the slipstream, you get a lot more propulsion with the feet this way as opposed to straight back. But the question I have is related to the tool that we need for breaststroke, which is just the opposite of butterfly backstroke, and that's pronation. And I'm struggling, and it would be great for the podiatrists listening in to the show who have any dealings with swimming coaches who can tell them. And I've done stretches that I've learned I can get the plantar flexibility fairly easily with ankle stretches because those ligaments that are fairly small are pretty malleable in most swimmers, and especially younger ones, even older ones. But the problem I have is getting more pronation. So how do I get more pronation out of the ankle? Because that is absolutely essential for breaststroke. I have to draw my knees up, internally rotate my hips, and I've got to get those feet pointed straight out in order to capture or to get the surface area to push back with. So is there some exercises that I can use to help pronation? What would they be?
Yeah, I think the first one, and you're attuned to this for sure, is making sure the ankle joint is flexible enough. And you tell me, I would think that swimmers develop the calf pretty extensively, not to the degree that soccer players and, let's say, cyclists would, with that overpowering a very big calf relative to the anterior shin muscles. But I still believe that with all the plantar flexion kicking and so forth, as you know, and then you mentioned you have dorsiflexion as well, that there is a very strong calf pull that can lead to what we call an equinus, from the word equestrian, where the horse's hooves are kind of in this downward declinated position that becomes a challenge to overcome. And one of the ways that we do, not only with exercises of stretching both the gastroc and the soleus and the Achilles tendon, is that we sometimes add a night splint or day splint to the mix that can be done at rest, so that we're getting, let's say, more of a dorsiflexion angle, more extension in the upward direction on the ankle. Because once that gets limited, that will limit the foot's ability to roll in more if you don't have that available motion ready at the weighting. Pronation is really a triplane motion consisting of dorsiflexion, abduction towards the outside,
Right.
and an eversion movement. So to your point about how can we accomplish getting more strength in those areas, one of the ways is to just challenge with resistance bands those very movements. So we can put the foot in an attitude of inversion and put a resistance band and or weight, ankle weight, along the forefoot, and then we have the athlete or patient pronate up against it. And in that way, they are being challenged beyond just their body weight because they have that added resistance, either with a weight or resistance band. So those are some of the things that we do. Another thing that I've learned about lately, and I think this is a real something that you could noodle on a bit, and something that I learned from an Australian ski coach. As you know, the fascia runs through our entire length of our body. It's not just fascia, in the deltoid, defining the deltoid. There's a thin layer that vests the entire body. And because of that relationship, when we look at the front of the ankle and the anterior shin as it goes down into the foot, there's a layer of fascia there that when we wave the toes up, dorsiflex the toes, there is tension that is created. And what that will do is that will bring the ankle forward if we dorsiflex the toes. The reason I bring this up is the Australian ski coach, and he was actually a demo participant with the Australian ski team. One of the things that he does when skiers are finding themselves in the back seat, which happens when they get tossed around in the moguls, is to have the skiers dorsiflex the toes, which is not something that we're doing in shoes frequently because we don't think about it. It's a motor mapping phenomena that has to happen with practice, just like anything else. I had a ski coach tell me there's no practice makes perfect. There's perfect practice makes perfect movement. So it has to be refined movement and not just gross movement in terms of, just slamming the foot forward. One of the ways that we can accentuate those fine motor movements is to use what I sort of call the prehensile big toe to try to keep the foot flat, but only lift up as you're engaged with the floor, the big toe, and then reciprocally plant the big toe. If you can see it in the picture, I probably should have gone the other way here, to plant the big toe while we're engaging the small toes. And if you really get refined, you can plant the big toe and do a reverse playing the piano and go up with 2, 3, 4, and 5, which when you try this for the first time is almost impossible because nobody's used to engaging those small intrinsics. We wear shoes, we wear clogs. Maybe you would because you're wearing sandals at the pool deck more often, engaging those muscles. So those are a couple ways to start to engage and work the pronatory forces that you spoke of.
Let me ask you a question on the dorsiflexion, because that's interesting that you said to put it into a kind of a dorsiflected hold position with a splint or some type of fixed static stretch, basically, right? No, for a long period of time.
Especially when you don't have the available motion. That's a problem solution.
When I was at Indiana, Doc, you made me a pair of, you call them alligator shoes. They were Converse high tops. He nailed onto an incline of about 45 degrees. And, and then on pieces of wood, I would be walking around the dormitory with my toes pointed up in the air to try to stretch.
Oh, I would have loved to have seen that. If you, that could be in the swimming hall of fame at Indiana.
Well, I would love to tell you that it turned me into a great breaststroker, but unfortunately it didn't. So I don't know. I can't testify to the success of that particular apparatus. However, and that could have been because I hated wearing them and I didn't wear them enough, but it was a dynamic stretch. I was, obviously not stretching all the time, but as you walk and you move the leg forward, you put more stretch on it. Although you're always stretching to some degree. So it kind of begged the question I've seen the incline boards where you put your foot up there and you kind of step into it and dynamically stretch. And I always think that Achilles tendon is like stretching the transatlantic cable, it's so big and it's so strong. And then you've got that big gastric muscle, is it better to stretch it dynamically or is it better to hold it and just keep stretching it like you suggested?
So,
which is
so
more effective?
the answer is both, because, as you know, the muscle has the eccentric and concentric phases, the stabilization phases, and then the dynamic contractile. And what is being talked about a lot, particularly in the track world, and I imagine it'll sift its way down to the swim world, is this idea to not just think about eccentric and concentric phases as two independent phases, but almost as a continuum, because there's still things that are crossing over during those phasic activities. Obviously, there's the reciprocal muscles, but stabilization has its elements of dynamic portions to it, without getting too much into the weeds in the context of this interview. But so I think that there's a more fluid look at how we're looking at concentric and eccentric training phases.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm going to suggest to my athletes then to do both, but I also am going to try, because I've never done this before, and I think that's an interesting concept, to put the elastic band again to try to increase the eversion of the foot. But I also like your suggestion for abducting the foot with elevating the outer toes, in a like an exercise, pressing the first metatarsal down and lifting the outer side of the foot. Those are all fascinating, because I don't know that anybody's ever tried that. I mean, in swimming coaches, and unfortunately I'm not among them proudly, that they'll look at an athlete and says, breaststroke, it's with women, it's 80% of the velocity is being contributed from the kick. So it's a very kick dependent stroke. And without a kick in breaststroke, you don't have much going for you. And coaches tend to look at a swimmer and say, okay, you can kick breaststroke, you're a breaststroker, or you're not a breaststroker, because you can't. But how do we change that? How do we take the non-breaststroker, and can we turn them into a breaststroker? And it really is two joints. It's that ankle, which, you've really enlightened me. Thank you for how we change that. I don't know how changeable it is. I don't know how much additional abduction we can get, or how much additional eversion we can get. I do think we can definitely get more dorsiflexion with time and effort. And then the hip is also a very stubborn, big joint that doesn't, the internal rotation of that hip, I think, is key. And I don't know which one. I think they're both equally important in the breaststroke. I've had some athletes who didn't have much internal rotation, but still had good kicks because they had great pronation ability. And I've had others that had amazing internal rotation, but didn't have such good pronation, who could also kick. I think they probably are both important in being able to get that angle. And we fight for degrees, Ben. I mean, you think about the dynamics of swimming, but when you're trying to increase drag and you make 1 or 2 degrees of increased, angle, all of a sudden the drag forces go up tremendously. So I call swimming the sport of degrees, millimeters, and hundredths of seconds in timing, to make it work. But it's really good to know that there are some things we can do.
There is one more dynamic joint that I would like to add to your bag of tricks that you're working on both with your book and with your coaching. So we mentioned that the ankle simplified is what we call a gingivalis or hinge joint. Its primary function is just the up-down. It's fixed in an ankle mortise. A mortise, by its inherent definition, is something very stable, like mortar, and comes from that, when we cement things together. What we also know about the ankle, and it was what is coming to light, is there is a tib-fib junction that allows a little bit of swivel of eversion, inversion in the ankle joint, which is mainly a fixed hinge. So there is still some degrees that you can wiggle out of that. And there's been a lot of thought and discussion about osteopathic manipulation of that particular segment at the tib-fib lower ankle. This is something that comes into play with high ankle injuries as well, that ginks up the ankle. We know that as well. The other major component that we talk about with the foot that can't be overlooked is the subtalar joint, which is just below the ankle mortise. So the talus is part of the formal ankle. We know that it articulates with the tibia, the lower leg bone. But just below that, turns out there is a triplanar joint that has a tremendous amount of motion and is largely responsible for the pronation, supination phases. So up and in, down and out. That swivel, that's coming out of the lower subtalar joint. I wish I have my foot skeleton at home because I did a segment last week that I was using to demonstrate that. But we can look at any anatomy text and any foot model, we will see that rotation that occurs within the subtalar joint. So that is one that I would focus on with your coaching as well as your, footnotes for your text, I guess, pun intended there. I don't know where you are in your final revisions, but that's certainly something that you want to include, and, happy to help you with that. Interesting thing, as a sidebar, I talked to, and this might be helpful for you to kind of try. I talked to a physical therapist that worked at NIH doing research. And I am not a golfer by any stretch. I just happened to be there in Maryland with my son, and we stumbled on a restaurant. We were there seeing an art exhibition and stumbled on a restaurant. And it happened to be at a country club. We didn't even know that it was at a golf club. So I said to my son, let's hit a bucket of balls. The next thing you know, I'm talking to this therapist about golf technique, which I know nothing about. I'm lucky if I can connect on one and send it, 150 yards, which occasionally happens, but, after 7 mulligans. So at any rate, he clued us in and then started talking about a text that he is working on, where he is looking at standard increases for range of motion, that instead of doing the classic, I'm going to wiggle the distal part to achieve more motion proximally, he has the patient, he stabilizes the distal part. Let's say it were the hip. So he stabilizes distal to the hip, and then has the patient or athlete use their own inertia and muscle contraction to try to move. So it's the opposite way that osteopathic maneuvers have classically been done, in that usually it's the other way around. So I found it fascinating. I haven't played around with that. It's generally in trying to get everything explained and talked about in a visit, it's sometimes beyond the scope of that visit to get into more than a few of the intrinsic muscle exercises that I described, but I am fascinated about it. And I think it's an area that could be a big boon for sports medicine as well as rehabilitation. So something also to think about.
Yeah, that's particularly with the hip. You have to have the right apparatus for that to be able to stabilize the leg, basically, and turn the body rather than turning the leg.
Unless you're literally working one-on-one with a therapist or coach that is familiar with how to properly stabilize.
But that's an interesting concept, and in a way, you have much more mass in your body that can turn probably with more torque, more force. And it's a rotational motion we're looking for. But that's something to think about. I'm always looking for any clues on how to improve the flexibility.
Are you able to show us your book so that when people look on Amazon, they don't buy, if Phelps has a book, they make sure they get Gary Hall Sr.'s book?
I have 2, so I'm only going to show you the one that I just wrote. This is one that recently came out, and it's called Winning Life's Gold Medal. This is not the textbook that Dr. Pearl was mentioning. I wrote a book earlier called The Fundamentals of Fast Swimming. In fact, I probably have a shot of that text as well. I can show it to you, but if you remember Fundamentals of Fast Swimming. You'll find that on Amazon and or our website, theraceclub.com.
Which,
This
by the
book,
way, I meant to interject, and when I introduced you, I wanted to say this. I thought that you were the founder of that, and it turns out that your son was started it. And by the way, what a brilliant idea! I give both of you a lot of credit for that. Um, I've I've probably shared with you. I don't know if you remember the largest athletic accomplishment I was able to obtain was I went out for track as a walk-on at IU, ended up getting hurt my freshman year, and then converted over to bicycle racing, and they had the little 500 out there, which was a very competitive race after the movie Breaking Away. And I always felt that getting out on the road with Vince Hoser with the Cutters was a much better way of getting competition to be able to achieve at race day than just going within your own team. And I credit whosever idea that was first. If it was your son's, it was a great idea of bringing people from all over, because you learn a little bit of something from each competitor that you face, as well as, and I don't know if this was if this was an ulterior motive, getting a preview of where they're at, and then getting sort of a look at their headspace, how they react to pressure, how they react to a very simulated competition.
two of the greatest sprinters of all time as far as swimming were Anthony Irvin, who's still competing, by the way, and Gary Jr. And Anthony was only 19. Gary was, I think, 20 in the first training, around 24, 25. But they go head to head every day in competition, and they brought the best out of both of them. And then they end up tying in the Olympic Games that year in Sydney for the gold medal. How ironic was that? I actually had a dream that those guys were going to tie for the gold medal, and it came out.
Are you kidding me? When did you have that dream? How long before competition was that?
It was at the Olympic trials, and Gary won the trials. Anthony was just a couple tenth or two behind him. And they came out of the pool, and I said, the night before the swim, he said, guys, I dreamed you guys made the Olympic team and you went to Sydney and tied for the gold medal. And they laughed at that, but it turned out to end up being true. So sometimes the dreams do come true. But
what are the chances of that? How many times has a dead heat occurred in Olympic competition? Let's forget about worlds.
In swimming, I think only twice. Once in 1984 and once in 2000. There have been other ties for silver or bronze, but not for gold. I think those are the only two ties for gold medal that I can recall. There may have been others. I don't think so. They didn't start using the time clocks to hundredths of a second until I think it was 1972 was the first time that they used, the touchpad at the end of the pool.
Before we take the book down, Gary, the cover jacket there, are you able to share a couple of the most important? I know you got 10 of them, and I don't want you to give them all so nobody will buy your book on Amazon, but can you share maybe a couple of them that you've gathered over the years, your years of wisdom?
Well, there's 10 really life lessons, most of which were, either learned on the journey to the Olympic Games or at the Olympic Games. And a lot of the stories in here also pertain to my son, Gary Jr. And so there's a lot of anecdotes of him, but it's some of me and some of others that were in the Olympics and what I learned from their success or, lack of success in trying to get there. But I think, it's interesting, they're all different. They all resonate differently with different people. two of the ones that I think are most maybe a little out of the ordinary in terms of understanding life and the way life is one is entitled "We All Have a Russian Judge in Our Life." And what do I mean by this? Well, any of us old enough to know who lived through, the competition and adversarial relationship we've had with Russia, including all the way up into the last election or the one before this last one, knows that Russia is adversarial. And if you watch the Olympics, you see the Russian judges always awarding the American athletes low scores, and probably vice versa. But anyway, I make the point that we all encounter somebody in our life who wants to see us beaten up or lose or get defeated, and who's not on our team. And it doesn't matter in business and family and life. You find that Russian judge somewhere in your life, and how do you deal with that person? How do you minimize the damage from that, or how do you psychologically resolve yourself to work around them or with them, or just make a complete U-turn or left turn and go away from them? Because they're all over. The Russian judges are everywhere. The other one I kind of liked, and I like them all.
Can I before and I don't want to give away all of your book, but I would love to hear what you found as one of the solutions to break down that cycle. I have my own ideas about it, but I'm really curious to hear what yours are.
So you got to read the book now, Ben, to figure that out. There's 8
Can I
points
make a
in
deal
there.
with you?
Yeah.
If I buy this book, I will. I think it would be better to get it on the Race Club than Amazon or from you directly if you got a couple in your closet. But the deal is, I'm going to buy the book, but I'd like you to sign it and inscribe it.
Okay, well, you're gonna have to wait a little bit because my son is designing the hardcover. This is only an e-version right now. It's $4.99. Big investment for this book on Amazon. Print version will be like $12, but that's going to be out soon, and I will sign it for you. By the way, there's 8 recommendations I put in there on how to deal with your Russian judge, and I have my own, so you'll enjoy reading about my Russian. We all have at least one. Sometimes we have more than one, but anyway. The other chapter that I kind of they're all different, but the one particularly that I like and I talk about is on raising future Olympians, and I talk about my relationship with Gary Jr. and how I inspired him or helped him by not coaching him, not overdoing it, and I don't take any of the credit for his success at all. And I think in how we deal with our kids today, because there's a prevalence of attitude that being mediocre is okay. Everybody should get a trophy. Everybody should be given an award. We shouldn't emphasize winning or losing. That's just not life. That's not how humans act and interact. We love competition. We should be inspired by competition and incentivized by competition and rewarded for success.
Can I just interject a quick thing to dovetail on what you're saying? I coached soccer, and I was sort of cast as a little bit of a villain amongst the parents for wanting to have just a category of most improved, most valuable, and best team player. And I was sort of overruled by my what happens in, the suburban neighborhoods. It's sort of a movement as to what's actually going to happen when these certificates come out. And, it wasn't a big deal, but to your point, that has become part of the culture.
And it's tragic. I mean, the Communist Party proved many, many years ago that you can't take a company, take its profits and divide it equally among all the employees, or nobody wants to work because they don't have any incentive to work anymore. Same is true of your soccer team. If everybody's equal, nobody has the incentive to be the most improved. Nobody has the incentive to be the most valuable or, the best team player, whatever you want to call it. They need reward, but you need to have those incentives in life in order to succeed. And we can't take those away from kids or from adults. It doesn't work. So I'm glad to hear you say that.
at the same time, I think that there's something that I thought that, uh, especially your son, I hadn't heard a lot of anecdotes, but I'm sure you felt the same way, that although competition needs to happen, as you mentioned, um, and that is what gets, that's what helps to achieve greatness. We also want a fair playing field. And your son was very unpopularly outspoken about calling out even fellow teammates, not just from other countries. And I think he paid a price for it at the time. But I think it ended up being the correct thing to do. It wasn't necessarily the easy path if you want to be a spokesperson for Speedo, but that's what he decided to do, and he stuck to his guns with it, and I give him a lot of credit for doing that. He took some flack for it.
Yeah, and it's one of the tragedies is that we don't have even today necessarily an even playing field. And one of the chapters in here, the lessons, is called "Life is a Team Sport, Not an Individual Sport." And in that chapter, I discussed the two very successful 1976 men's team and the women's team that didn't really achieve success, but they won the last event of that Olympics, which was the 4x100 free relay against a cheating, steroid bolstered East German women's team who had three of the four fastest women in the world on their relay. And the women decided they were not going to be denied in spite of the fact they knew they were cheating. And were called out for calling them cheats as poor sports, not being good people. It was, and yet it was blatant, and yet they were criticized for condemning them, just like Gary was for calling people out. But at any rate, that's part of the chapter, and it was one of the most, maybe the most heroic swim or any Olympic event of all time for those four
What year was
girls.
that? I'm sorry, did you say?
1976.
Okay.
And there's a documentary of a movie that was made called The Last Gold. And if you can find it on Netflix, watch the movie because
Oh, absolutely.
you'll see me carrying a flag in the movie there too. But that was an amazing Olympics, both from that perspective and also the men's team that went on to win, I think, 27 or 28 medals out of the 35 possible medals. We just dominated the competition. But a lot due to the team spirit, both of the successes of that one event that they won against insurmountable odds, and the men just dominating had everything to do with the team spirit, not individuals wanting to win, but the team coming together and the psychology of that. So very, very valuable lesson. Teams exist in all walks of life, not
Well,
just
I'd
in
like
sports.
to, that's some great anecdotes. I learned a couple, so many stories with the Hall legacy. I will say though, in terms of you not, you're crediting all Gary's success to himself. There is one factor that I think did come from you, and that's genetics. And then, as I understand, not only does the Hall genetic legacy exist, but there is also his grandfather was a champion swimmer as well.
Well, and in fact, I would give more of the credit to Gary's success to the Keating side than I would to the Hall side. His grandfather, whom he idolized, by the way, as a person, and a very successful businessman who encountered his own Russian judge, which is also in the book. That story is in the book, and was imprisoned for 5 years during the most probably uh, important and vulnerable years of Gary's life as an adolescent. His idol was sent to prison. But he was an NC2A champion swimmer in the 40s and actually a great sprinter in his day. And I was never that. So Gary got his sprinting ability not from me, but from his grandfather and from his mother. So I give them the credit for his great talent. Anyway,
Well, despite your accomplishments, you're a very humble person, Gary. I don't know if that comes from, going to undergraduate in the Midwest. I always felt that people were very down to earth out in Indiana, and not too pretentious.
I agree with that, but I have to give more credit to my mom and dad, and probably the same with you would for your parents, for how you're raised, and that seems to help the most.
Absolutely. They loved me unconditionally, that's for sure. And I think that's the most important thing. And it was great that you were not one of those parents with your son that tried to pigeonhole him into swimming. He told me he participated in all kinds of sports
Yeah.
and enjoyed them. I did want to see if you had any moments of levity that you'd like to share, either with you and your son, with you and the teams that you participated in. There's three Olympiads that you got to cross over with. We're in coming out of some somber times here, so I think laughter is good medicine. I do some comedy skits on the side. I don't know if you've seen them. I got a pretty good Rocky Balboa imitation. So
Well, I'd love to hear that. That would be more
I will
interesting.
send them to you. I will send them to you.
So I do have one. I have one story with one of my teammates, a guy that you would remember, and if any of your audience is old enough, hopefully they haven't forgotten the legendary Mark Spitz. Mark Spitz was a teammate of mine in Indiana. He was a year older, but and Mark Spitz is remembered as being the guy that won 7 gold medals in the 1972 Munich Olympics, which was the most at the time and only surpassed later, many decades later, by Michael Phelps. But what they don't know about Mark was one of the most, he was a hypochondriac. A lot of people don't know that about him. And we used to laugh because in practice, there was not a workout that we went to where Mark did not have what he thought was either a myocardial infarction or a stroke. He thought he had a cerebral bleed, but he would say, I'm having a heart attack right now. And he was doing anything to try to get out of workout. But he was very, very suggestible. He was hypochondriac, very aware of his body, thinking, whenever he had a pain, he was dying. But he was also a very suggestible guy. So one year we used to go to Florida and train at the Hall of Fame in Fort Lauderdale. And we're down there. And our team that year, this was like 1971, our team would have been probably the 5th greatest country in the world. Indiana could have gone to the Olympics as a country and won more medals than almost any other country in the world. Out of the 12 world records that were on the books, the Indiana swimmers held 10 of them. I mean, that's how dominant we were. So the Miami Herald reporter calls Doc up and says, I'd love to interview you guys. Can I talk to, Gary Holm and Mark Spitz and do a little interview? And he says, sure, tomorrow afternoon would be great. So that afternoon, the word gets around that the interview is going to go on. And one of the guys who's training with us in the same lane with Mark and I is a guy from Canada named Ron Jacks. And Ron was a pretty good swimmer. He wasn't a great swimmer, he was a good swimmer. But he had this uncanny ability to tease Mark. Doc wouldn't let people tease Mark, but Ron could tease Mark anytime. He just had that, he couldn't help himself. And he knew how suggestible Mark was. So he just couldn't hold back. And so we get done with this long set. We're sitting on the edge of the pool and Mark's got his feet up on the gutter. And Ron Jacks looks over and he said, Mark, what is wrong with your ankles? And Mark goes, what do you mean? He said, I don't know, but they're all swollen. They look really bad. They look painful. Mark said, what? And he's looking down at his ankles, and then we do another set. And then he sits up on the side of the pool and Mark and Ron Jacks said, Mark, you better have those ankles checked out because they definitely don't look right. And he's totally fabricating this. I mean, it's just out of the blue. I mean, it's just completely
just ad-libbing the whole thing.
Ad-libbing. And so sure enough, at the end of practice, we get out, we go over to get our towels, and Mark is limping He's like limping to get his towel. He's like hobbling along, barely able to get to his towel, grabs his towel, dries off. Then we're in the car on the way home. We're talking about open water swimming. And everybody's saying how maybe when they're done swimming, they're going to go into open waters. And Mark says, I would do that. He said, but I don't know if my ankles would hold up in the cold water.
That is
Like,
classic.
what? So the
That is
next day,
classic.
we're interviewed by the Miami Herald, and they said, the reporter asked both of us, said, "What do you think you guys are? You're expected to win the NC2As this year." And she asked both of us, "How do you think you're going to do it?" And I said, we've got an awesome team. We're going to be great. We're going to be tough. If anybody beats us, more power to them. And Mark turns to her and says, "If my ankles hold up, I think we can do really well." And I start to laugh. And sure enough, in the article, she says, "What's wrong with your ankles?" I said, "Well, they're really weak. I have weak ankles."
Wow.
And the next day in the article, it talks about how the Indiana can win the NC2As if Mark Spitz's ankles hold up. And Doc is furious. He comes to us, he says, "What is this about Mark's ankles? Where is this coming from?" And Mark says, "Well, Ron Jacks told me my ankles look bad." And Doc says, "Ron, you idiot, what are you doing?"
That's an awesome story.
So Ron had to go back and apologize and said, "No, Mark, your ankles are fine." And we ended up winning the NC2As, and his ankles were healthy again.
Well, I had heard a couple stories where your son had some fun when he had said something about the reciprocal motion of what he was doing, sitting on a raft, because I think he was, or laying on a raft and moving his arms this way because he wanted to get reciprocal motion. So I'm not sure how that was just sort of genius with getting out of, swim laps, or whether there was something to it. But what I do know, and what I appreciate about any athlete that has a sense of when they need to take a break for competition, is that you cannot be on all the time. You have to have deceleration phases in your mental and physical training mode.
Yeah.
And I felt the same way when I was training running, and I would sometimes, before a cross country meet the next day, I'd go out and play golf, and our coach would want us to be doing some sprint work, and I was like, no, it's kind of like a boxer, being abstinent before the fight. You want to kind of save yourself for the event, and then do as best you can.
Yeah. Well, you're right. You have to know your body. And Gary was really, really good at doing that. He knew when to push and when to back off. He was criticized by a lot of coaches for not working all the time. Well, he knew when to rest. He knew when to work. And in the end, he was right. So.
Did you know that he had a story with regards to the same sort of thing that he withheld? It wasn't to the degree of suggestibility, but I heard this from one of his interviews, where he had a teammate that had recently had something serious happen with a parent, and he wasn't going to say anything negative per se, but as you know, in the green room with competition, as you're sizing people up and looking and talking, almost anything you could say could be a distraction that could cause that hundredth of a second. And he decided, because it was his teammate, not to mention something about, I hope everything works out with, whoever it was. So I thought that was interesting, that he was aware of those factors that can influence, milliseconds.
Yeah, actually, I hadn't heard that story. So there's a lot of stories Gary shares with others that he doesn't even share with me. I'd love to hear that one from him sometime. But he's got a book of interesting stories. I've encouraged him at some point, and he would, he's actually a really good writer too. He didn't even need an author to help him. He could write it himself. But,
well, listen, I know we're wrapping up towards the end, and I think that story with Mark Spitz kind of ended things with a bang. I love it. I, incidentally had read an article during his comeback that as scrupulous as he was with his body when he was in his prime with you, during his comeback, as the article goes, not my own interpretation, the journalist had said that he was fooling himself at one point, quote, missing laps. So it was interesting to have that as a read. We all want to be the lion that we were back in the day, but you can't fool Father Time, and you have to reckon with that, I suppose. But anyway, I'll let you have the final word with anything else that you think you'd want to share with this segment.
No, just thank you for having me on and for mostly helping me as a coach be a better coach. Our athletes increasing the ankle flexibility, huge factor in our sport, and for educating me about the ankle joint because I didn't really understand it. It's a pretty fascinating joint, and that whole subtalar, joint ability to abduct and to evert or invert is pretty fascinating, and how we can learn to utilize that better. But I'm going to take some of your suggestions and put them to good practice, and hopefully we'll see some improvements in our swing.
Yeah, and down the line, maybe a year or two down the line, I'd love to see how those have integrated in. It would be great to have a follow-up at some point in the future.
Absolutely. Well, thank you,
All right.
Dan. Appreciate
I'm
it.
gonna speak with you just for 2 minutes offline after we close out. Okay.
You bet.
All right.